The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the weathered building that served as Fort Bowie's general store, and Grace Remington stepped down into the Arizona dust without making a sound. Her cream-colored dress, already gathering the rust-red dirt of this untamed land that would now be her home. She clutched a small carpetbag in both hands, her knuckles white beneath her traveling gloves, and surveyed the town that stretched before her in the late afternoon sun of July 1878. Fort Bowie sat nestled in Apache Pass, a military outpost turned settlement where soldiers and civilians lived side by side in an uneasy truce with the land and its original inhabitants. The buildings were a mixture of adobe and rough-hewn wood, practical structures built for survival rather than beauty. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touching a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Grace had not spoken in 3 years, not since the night her father died and her stepmother's cruelty had stolen her voice along with everything else. The doctors in Philadelphia had found nothing physically wrong with her vocal cords, but the words simply would not come. They remained locked inside her chest like birds in a cage, fluttering and desperate, but unable to break free. Her stepmother had wasted no time in arranging this marriage, eager to be rid of the burden of a silent stepdaughter who could not earn her keep in any respectable manner. The advertisement had been answered by a rancher named Daniel Patterson, who needed a wife to help manage his homestead and perhaps provide companionship in this lonely territory. Grace had seen his photograph, a stern-faced man with eyes that seemed kind despite the hardness the camera had captured. She had agreed to come, not because she wanted marriage, but because anything was better than remaining under her stepmother's roof. A tall figure detached itself from the shade of the general store's porch, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. Daniel Patterson was broader than his photograph had suggested, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his work shirt and hands that looked capable of both gentleness and great strength. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that held her attention, deep brown eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away and hold his gaze simultaneously. "Miss Remington." His voice was low, rougher than she had imagined, with the distinctive drawl of someone who had spent years under the western sun. "I'm Daniel Patterson. Welcome to Fort Bowie." Grace nodded, her mouth opening automatically before she remembered that no words would come. She closed it again, feeling the familiar flush of shame color her cheeks. From her carpetbag, she withdrew the small slate and chalk she carried for communication, writing quickly in neat script. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Patterson. The journey was long but uneventful." Daniel's eyes flickered to the slate, and Grace watched his expression carefully for signs of anger or disappointment. Many men would consider her deception unforgivable, as her stepmother had not mentioned her condition in the letters arranging the marriage. But Daniel simply nodded, reaching for her larger trunk as the stagecoach driver hauled it down from the roof. "I figured there was something your people weren't telling me," he said, not unkindly. "Letters came from your stepmother's hand, not yours. And she was mighty eager to see you settled, even this far from Philadelphia." Grace wrote again. "You knew, suspected," Daniel corrected, hefting her trunk onto his shoulder with an ease that spoke of his strength. "Didn't know what exactly, but I knew something. Does it pain you?" "Your throat, I mean." She shook her head, and he accepted this with another nod. "Then we will figure it out as we go," he said simply. "My wagon is just down the street. The ranch is about 5 miles from here up in the foothills. It is not fancy, but it is sturdy and the land is good." As they walked through the dusty street, Grace became aware of the curious stares from the townspeople. A woman in a faded calico dress paused in sweeping her porch to watch them pass. Three men outside the saloon stopped their conversation to assess the newcomer. Grace kept her eyes forward, her spine straight despite her exhaustion. She had endured worse scrutiny in Philadelphia. Daniel's wagon was indeed waiting, a sturdy farm wagon with a team of 2 horses, both bays with intelligent eyes. He loaded her trunk into the back with practiced efficiency, then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hands were warm through her dress, and he released her the moment she was settled, as if aware that she might be frightened by his touch. The ride to the ranch took them away from the settlement and up into terrain that grew increasingly beautiful despite its harshness. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the sky, their arms raised in permanent supplication. Scrub brush dotted the rust-colored earth, and in the distance, Grace could see the shimmer of heat rising from the desert floor. It was nothing like Philadelphia, with its neat streets and proper houses and the constant press of humanity. Here, the world felt vast and empty and somehow more honest. "I should tell you about the place," Daniel said, his eyes on the road ahead. "I have 200 acres, most of it grazing land for cattle. I run about 100 head with hopes to expand. There is a small herd of horses too, maybe 15 or so. I do most of the work myself, but I hire help during roundup and branding. There is a Mexican family, the Rodriguezes, who have the neighboring spread. Maria Rodriguez sometimes comes by to trade eggs for milk, and she is good company if you find yourself lonely." Grace listened carefully, trying to build a picture of her new life in her mind. She wanted to ask questions but settled for watching his face as he spoke, noting the way his expression softened when he mentioned his land. "The house has 2 bedrooms," he continued, and now there was a note of awkwardness in his voice. "I want you to know that I do not expect anything from you that you are not ready to give. We are married in law, or will be once we see the preacher tomorrow, but that does not mean I will force myself on you. You will have your own room, and I will wait until you are ready if that time ever comes." Grace's hands tightened on her carpetbag. She wrote quickly, "You are kind to say so." "It is not kindness," Daniel said, his jaw tightening. "It is decency. I wanted a wife, not a prisoner or a servant. If we cannot find our way to something real between us, then we will at least be civil partners in this enterprise." They rode in silence for a while, and Grace found herself relaxing despite her circumstances. There was something steady about Daniel, something that spoke of a man who kept his word. She had known so few such men in her life. The ranch appeared as they crested a small rise, and Grace felt her breath catch again. The house was indeed modest, a long, low building of adobe with a wooden porch that wrapped around 2 sides. But it was well maintained, with a neat garden plot near the front and curtains visible in the windows. Behind the house stood a barn, a corral, and various outbuildings. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch and climbed down, moving around to help Grace descend. This time, his hands lingered a moment longer, steadying her as her feet found the ground. "Welcome home," he said quietly, and Grace felt something shift in her chest at those words. The inside of the house was surprisingly comfortable. The main room served as kitchen and sitting area combined, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy table with 4 chairs near the window. The floor was swept clean, and though the furnishings were simple, everything was orderly and well kept. Daniel showed her to the smaller of the 2 bedrooms, a space just large enough for a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin. "I will bring your trunk in," he said, already backing toward the door. "Supper will be ready in an hour. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread, but it will fill you up." Left alone, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new room. Through the single window, she could see the mountains in the distance, painted gold and purple by the setting sun. The room was clean but impersonal, waiting for her to make it her own. She thought of her room in Philadelphia, with its floral wallpaper, and the books her father had given her before he died. All of that was gone now, packed away or sold to pay her stepmother's debts. She removed her traveling dress and washed as best she could with the water in the basin, then changed into a simpler cotton dress more suitable for the climate. When she emerged, Daniel was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans with the kind of focused attention that suggested this was not a task he enjoyed. The table was already set with 2 plates and cups. "Sit," he said when he noticed her. "It is almost ready." The meal was as simple as he had promised, but the food was hot and filling, and Grace found herself hungrier than she had realized. They ate in silence for several minutes before Daniel spoke again. "I suppose you are wondering what your days will look like here," he said. "I do not expect you to do all the things a wife might normally do. I have been managing on my own for 3 years since I started this place, and I can continue to handle the heavy work. But if you want to help with the garden, or the chickens, or the cooking, I would not turn down the assistance. Mostly I just thought it would be good to have someone around. Gets lonely out here talking to cattle and horses all day." Grace reached for her slate. "I can cook and clean. I can help with the animals if you teach me. I do not mind work." "Fair enough," Daniel said. "We will figure out a rhythm. And tomorrow we will go into town and see Reverend Walsh. Make this official if you are still willing." Grace nodded, though her stomach tightened at the thought. Marriage to a stranger in a strange land with no voice to speak her vows. But what choice did she have? The money for her return journey was already spent, and even if it were not, she had nowhere to go back to. That night, lying in her narrow bed with the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night filtering through her window, Grace let herself cry for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. She cried for her father, dead 3 years but still missed every day. She cried for her lost voice and the life she might have had. And she cried for the fear that gripped her heart, the fear that she would never be able to be a proper wife to the man sleeping in the next room, and that his patience would eventually run out. Morning came too soon, announced by a rooster's crow and the pale light of dawn creeping through her window. Grace dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a dove-gray silk that had been her mother's. When she emerged, Daniel was already up, dressed in clean trousers and a white shirt that made him look almost formal. "You look nice," he said, then cleared his throat as if embarrassed by the compliment. "We should get going. The Reverend likes to do his business in the morning before the heat sets in." The ride back to Fort Bowie was different in the morning light. The town was coming alive, with shopkeepers opening their stores and women heading to the well for water. Daniel guided the wagon to a small church at the edge of the settlement, a whitewashed building with a simple cross on top. Reverend Walsh was a portly man with kind eyes and a booming voice that seemed incongruous with his gentle demeanor. He listened as Daniel explained Grace's condition, then nodded as if such things were commonplace. "The Lord hears the prayers of the heart as clearly as those spoken aloud," he said. "And the vows are binding whether spoken or written. Let us proceed." The ceremony was brief, almost perfunctory. Grace wrote her vows on her slate, and the Reverend read them aloud while Daniel spoke his own. 2 townspeople served as witnesses, a shopkeeper named Samuel and his wife, both strangers to Grace. When it was done, Reverend Walsh pronounced them man and wife, and Daniel paid him with coins from his pocket. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend said with a smile. Daniel looked at Grace, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead in a kiss so chaste it made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. It was the kiss of a man honoring his promise, and Grace felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. They stopped at the general store on the way out of town, where Daniel introduced her to the proprietor, a weathered woman named Martha who looked Grace up and down with assessing eyes. "So you are Patterson's mail-order bride," Martha said bluntly. "Heard you came in yesterday." "Welcome to Fort Bowie, Mrs. Patterson. We do not stand on ceremony much out here, but we look after our own. You need anything, you come see me." Grace wrote on her slate, "Thank you, that is kind." Martha squinted at the writing, then nodded. "Silent, are you? Well, that is no matter. Some folks talk too much anyway. You need fabric for dresses. That silk will not last long in this climate." Daniel ordered supplies while Grace looked at the bolts of fabric Martha had available. She selected 2 lengths of sturdy cotton, one in a practical brown and one in a soft blue that reminded her of the sky. Daniel paid without question, adding the fabric to the growing pile of flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was surprisingly comfortable. Grace woke with the sun and prepared breakfast while Daniel tended to the animals. They ate together, then Daniel would head out to work on the ranch while Grace tackled the housework. The house was small enough that keeping it clean was not difficult, and she found satisfaction in the simple tasks of sweeping, washing, and cooking. In the afternoons, when the heat was too intense for heavy work, Daniel would return to the house and they would sit on the porch together. Sometimes he would read aloud from the newspaper that came on the weekly stage, his voice rising and falling as he shared news of the outside world. Sometimes he would talk about his plans for the ranch, his hopes to build a bigger herd and maybe add some sheep for wool. And sometimes they would just sit in companionable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the land. Grace began to learn the rhythms of ranch life. She fed the chickens each morning, collecting their eggs in a basket Daniel had given her. She watered the garden, coaxing tomatoes and squash and beans from the stubborn soil. She learned to milk the cow, though her hands were clumsy at first, and Daniel had to show her the proper technique, his larger hands guiding hers with a patience that made her throat tight. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Grace was preparing supper when she heard shouting from outside. She rushed to the window and saw Daniel near the corral, struggling with a horse that was clearly in distress. The animal was rearing and bucking, its eyes wild with panic. Without thinking, Grace grabbed her skirts and ran outside. As she approached, she could see that the horse had gotten tangled in some loose wire, the metal biting into its leg. Blood was already staining the animal's coat. "Stay back," Daniel called when he saw her. "He is scared and might hurt you." But Grace did not stay back. She moved slowly toward the horse, her hands outstretched in a gesture of peace. She had always had a way with animals, even as a child. Her father used to say she could calm a wild dog with just her presence. The horse's eyes rolled toward her, and Grace hummed, a low sound that came from deep in her chest. It was not speech, not words, but it was sound, and it seemed to surprise both her and the horse. She continued humming, a lullaby her mother had sung to her years ago, and slowly approached the terrified animal. Daniel watched in amazement as the horse began to calm, its movements becoming less frantic. Grace reached out and touched its neck, still humming, her fingers gentle on its sweat-dampened coat. When the horse was finally still, trembling but no longer fighting, Daniel moved in quickly and cut away the wire. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder as he examined the horse's leg. The cut was not as deep as he had feared. "I have been working with horses my whole life, and I have never seen anything like that." Grace pulled out her slate. "I cannot explain it. Animals have always responded to me. My father said I had a gift." "A gift indeed," Daniel said, meeting her eyes. "Thank you. You may have saved this horse's life. If he had kept fighting like that, he would have broken his leg for certain." That night, over a late supper of fried salt pork and potatoes, Daniel asked her about her life before Arizona. Grace hesitated, then began to write, the chalk scratching across the slate in the lamplight. She told him about her father, a professor of literature who had filled their home with books and ideas. She told him about her mother's death when she was 12, and how her father had remarried 2 years later, desperate for someone to help raise his daughter. She did not tell him everything. She did not tell him about the night her father died, about finding his body at the bottom of the stairs and her stepmother's cold satisfaction. She did not tell him about the accusations, quickly hushed, or the way her voice had fled in the face of such horror. Some things were too dark to share, even in writing, but Daniel seemed to understand that she was holding something back. "Everyone has wounds they are not ready to show," he said quietly. "I have my own. Maybe someday we will both feel safe enough to share them." Another week passed, and Grace began to feel less like a stranger in her own life. The house responded to her touch, becoming more of a home with each day. She made curtains for the windows from the fabric Martha had sold her, stitching them by hand in the evenings while Daniel repaired tack or read by lamplight. She planted herbs near the kitchen door, basil and thyme and rosemary, imagining the meals she would make once they were grown. Maria Rodriguez came to visit one morning, a plump, cheerful woman with graying hair and a smile that lit up her round face. She brought eggs and fresh tortillas, speaking in rapid Spanish mixed with English while her hands moved expressively. When she learned that Grace could not speak, she barely paused. No matter, Maria said, patting Grace's hand. "I talk enough for both of us, my husband always says. You are lonely out here, I think. You come visit me, yes. I teach you to make tortillas proper, not these sad things the gringos make." Grace found herself smiling, and she wrote on her slate, "I would like that very much." Maria became a regular visitor, stopping by once or twice a week with some excuse about borrowing sugar or returning a tool her husband had borrowed. But Grace knew the real reason was companionship, and she was grateful for it. Maria filled the house with chatter and laughter, teaching Grace Spanish words and sharing gossip about the other ranchers in the area. She also shared wisdom about living in this harsh land, about preserving food for the winter and recognizing the signs of coming storms. Summer deepened into August, and the heat became almost unbearable. Grace took to rising even earlier, doing her work in the cool of the morning and resting during the worst of the afternoon heat. She noticed that Daniel was working longer hours, preparing for the roundup that would come in the fall. He would leave before dawn and return after dark, exhausted and covered in dust, and Grace would have hot food waiting for him no matter how late he arrived. One particularly hot evening, Grace was in the kitchen when she heard Daniel come in. She turned with a smile, ready to serve his supper, and stopped short. His face was tight with pain and he was favoring his left arm. She quickly wrote, "What happened?" "It is nothing," Daniel said, but his voice was strained. "Just a disagreement with a stubborn calf. I will be fine." Grace pointed to a chair, her expression brooking no argument. Daniel sat, and she gently helped him remove his shirt. Her breath caught when she saw the massive bruise spreading across his ribs, already purple and swelling. She fetched cold water and clean rags, working as gently as she could to clean the abrasion where the calf's hoof had broken the skin. Daniel sat still under her ministrations, his jaw clenched against the pain. When she had finished bandaging him, she poured him a generous measure of whiskey from the bottle he kept for medicinal purposes. "You should have been a nurse," Daniel said after he had drunk the whiskey. "You have gentle hands." Grace blushed and turned away to dish up his supper, but as she set the plate before him, Daniel caught her hand. His fingers were warm and calloused against hers. "Thank you," he said softly. "Not just for this, but for everything. For making this house a home. For the way you care for things. I know this is not the life you would have chosen, but I am glad you are here." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to tell him that she was glad too, that the past month had been the most peaceful she had known in years, that she was beginning to imagine a future here that did not terrify her. But the words would not come, trapped as always behind the cage of her fear. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently before pulling away to let him eat. It was not enough, but it was what she could give. The injury kept Daniel closer to the house for the next few days, doing lighter work and resting more than usual. Grace found herself enjoying his presence, the way he would sit at the table and talk to her while she worked, or the way he would read aloud in the evenings, his voice painting pictures of far-off places and adventures. One afternoon, when the heat had driven them both to seek shelter on the shaded porch, Daniel asked her about her humming. "That sound you made with the horse," he said. "I have not heard you make it since. Can you do it whenever you want, or was it just that once?" Grace considered this, then opened her mouth and hummed a few notes. The sound was rusty, unpracticed, but it came easier than she expected. Daniel's face lit up. "That is remarkable. Have you tried to speak? Since you came here, I mean." Grace shook her head. She pulled out her slate. "The doctors said there is nothing wrong with me, but when I try to speak, nothing comes out. It is like the words die before they reach my lips." "What happened?" Daniel asked gently. "What made you stop speaking?" Grace stared at her slate for a long moment, the chalk poised above the surface. Finally, she began to write, the words coming slowly at first, then faster as the story poured out. She told him about finding her father at the bottom of the stairs, about the way her stepmother had claimed it was an accident. She told him about the doubts that had plagued her, the suspicions she could never voice. And she told him how, when the constable had asked her what she had seen, no sound would come out, and her silence had sealed the verdict of accidental death. Daniel read the words, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he set the slate down carefully and took both of Grace's hands in his. "That is a heavy burden to carry alone," he said. "No wonder you stopped speaking. Sometimes the weight of what we know is too much for words." Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, the first time she had cried in front of another person since her father's death. Daniel pulled her gently into his arms, holding her while she wept, one hand stroking her hair in a gesture of comfort so tender it made her cry harder. "You are safe here," he murmured against her hair. "Whatever happened in Philadelphia, it cannot touch you here. I will make sure of it." Grace let herself believe him, at least for that moment. In his arms, with the desert wind rustling the scrub brush and the mountains standing eternal in the distance, she felt safer than she had in years. As summer faded into early fall, Grace continued to grow into her role as Daniel's wife. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and she learned to preserve them for winter, filling jars with pickles and tomatoes and beans. The chickens laid well, and Grace traded the extra eggs to Maria for fresh milk and cheese. She was learning to bake bread in the temperamental oven, and though her early attempts were dense and heavy, Daniel ate them without complaint and pronounced each one better than the last. The physical distance between them had begun to close as well, in small, almost imperceptible ways. Daniel would touch her shoulder as he passed behind her chair. Grace would adjust his collar before he headed out to work. They had developed a comfortable intimacy that felt natural and unforced, built on mutual respect and growing affection. One morning in late September, Grace woke to find Daniel already gone. A note on the table saying he had ridden out early to check on the cattle in the north pasture. She went about her morning routine, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, tending the garden and starting a pot of stew for dinner. It was nearly noon when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. She stepped out onto the porch and felt her blood run cold. Daniel was riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat, and even from a distance she could see the tension in his body. He pulled up in front of the house and dismounted in one fluid motion. "We have a problem," he said, his voice tight. "Rustlers hit the Rodriguez place last night. Took about 20 head and roughed up Maria's husband pretty badly when he tried to stop them. They will likely hit other ranches too." Grace's hand flew to her throat. She reached for her slate. "Is he all right? Is Maria safe?" "He will recover, and Maria is fine, just scared." "But this is serious, Grace. These men are dangerous and we are isolated out here. I need to ride into Fort Bowie and see about getting some help, maybe form a group to patrol the area. I do not want to leave you alone, but I do not want to take you into town if there is trouble brewing either." Grace wrote quickly, "I will be fine, I can shoot if I need to." She saw his skeptical expression and added, "My father taught me. I am a good shot." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, there is a rifle over the fireplace and a pistol in the drawer of my nightstand. Keep the doors locked and do not open them for anyone you do not know. I will be back before dark." He started to turn away, then turned back and pulled Grace into a quick, fierce embrace. "Be safe," he said against her hair, and then he was gone, riding back toward town at a gallop that spoke of his urgency. Grace spent the afternoon in a state of nervous energy, jumping at every sound. She brought the rifle down from over the fireplace and checked that it was loaded, then did the same with the pistol. She had told Daniel the truth about her shooting. Her father had believed that every person should know how to defend themselves, and he had taught her to shoot tin cans in the woods behind their Philadelphia home. But it had been years, and she had never aimed at anything living. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when Grace heard hoofbeats again. She grabbed the rifle and positioned herself by the window, peering out carefully. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Daniel's horse, but it was followed quickly by concern when she saw he was not alone. Another rider was with him, a younger man with sandy hair and a badge on his vest. Grace opened the door as they dismounted. Daniel's face was grim. "This is Deputy Morgan," he said. "He is going to stay here tonight, keep watch. The sheriff thinks the rustlers might hit this area next." The deputy tipped his hat to Grace. "Madam, I will try not to be any trouble, just going to keep an eye on things from the barn." Grace nodded and stepped back to let them in. She served supper to both men, a simple meal of the stew she had prepared earlier and fresh biscuits. The deputy ate quickly and excused himself to take up his post, leaving Grace and Daniel alone. "I do not like this," Daniel said, pushing his food around his plate. "I do not like you being in danger because of me, because of this place." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. She squeezed it firmly, trying to convey without words that she was not afraid, that she trusted him to keep them safe. Daniel turned his hand to lace his fingers with hers. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met," he said softly. "You have faced so much and you still keep going." "I am in awe of you, Grace. You know that, do you not?" Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not pull her hand away. Instead, she reached for her slate with her free hand and wrote one-handed, the letters shaky but legible. "You have been good to me, better than I deserved or expected." "I am grateful, grateful," Daniel repeated, and something flickered across his face. "I do not want your gratitude, Grace. I want more than that, but I will not push. I promised I would wait until you were ready, and I meant it." He stood, still holding her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the lamplight, so close Grace could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Then Daniel raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly it made her heart ache. "Good night, Grace," he said. "Sleep well if you can. I will be right here if you need me." That night, Grace lay in her narrow bed and thought about Daniel's words. "I want more than that." She knew what he meant, and she was surprised to find that the idea did not frighten her as much as it once had. Over the past months, Daniel had become more than just the stranger she had married. He had become her partner, her friend, and perhaps, if she was brave enough to reach for it, something more. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to the sound of gunfire. Grace bolted upright, her heart pounding. More shots rang out and she heard shouting from outside. She grabbed her robe and the pistol from her nightstand, then rushed to the window. In the moonlight, she could see figures moving near the corral. The cattle were bellowing in distress, and the horses were rearing in their pen. More gunshots, and then Daniel's voice, shouting something she could not make out. Grace did not hesitate. She ran to the front door and threw it open, raising the pistol with both hands the way her father had taught her. She could see Daniel and the deputy near the barn, both firing at the rustlers who were trying to drive the cattle away. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more, dark shapes on horseback. One of the rustlers broke away from the group and rode toward the house. Grace could see the gun in his hand, could see him raising it to fire at Daniel, who had his back turned. Without thinking, Grace aimed and pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her back a step, but she kept her grip on the gun. The rustler jerked in his saddle, then tumbled to the ground. His horse bolted, and Grace watched in shock as the man lay still in the dirt. The sound of her shot seemed to galvanize the other rustlers. They abandoned their attempt to steal the cattle and rode off into the darkness, leaving their fallen comrade behind. Daniel and the deputy fired a few more shots after them, then rushed toward the house. "Grace." Daniel's voice was sharp with fear. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still staring at the fallen man. Daniel followed her gaze, then looked back at her with something like wonder. "You shot him," he said. "You saved my life." The deputy was checking the rustler, and he called out, "He is alive, just winged. You got him in the shoulder, madam. Good shooting." Grace's hands began to shake, and the pistol dropped from her nerveless fingers. Daniel caught her before she could fall, sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her back into the house. He set her down in a chair and knelt before her, his hands gripping hers. "Breathe," he said. "Just breathe. You are all right. You did what you had to do." Grace sucked in a shuddering breath, then another. The shaking began to subside, replaced by a strange sort of calm. She had shot a man. She had defended her home and her husband, and she had done it without hesitation. The knowledge settled into her bones like bedrock. The deputy came in with the rustler, who was conscious and cursing. "I am taking him into town," the deputy said. "The sheriff will want to question him. Mr. Patterson, you and your wife should probably come into town tomorrow and give statements." That was self-defense, clear as day, but we need to make it official. After the deputy had left, leading the wounded rustler on foot while the man's horse followed behind, Daniel and Grace sat together in the pre-dawn darkness. Daniel had wrapped a blanket around Grace's shoulders, and now he sat beside her, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth. I have never been so scared in my life as when I saw you standing on that porch with a gun, Daniel said finally. But I have never been so grateful either. If you had not acted when you did, I might be dead right now. Grace pulled her slate toward her. I could not let him hurt you. I acted on instinct. Instinct or not, you were incredibly brave. Daniel turned to look at her fully. Grace, I need to tell you something. I know I promised to wait to give you time, but after tonight I cannot keep it in anymore. I am falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the day you arrived, so calm and collected despite being in a strange place with a strange man. But definitely since you calmed that horse, and since you cried in my arms, and since you made this house feel like a home. I love you, Grace. You do not have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. Grace's heart felt too large for her chest. She stared at Daniel's face, at the sincerity and vulnerability written there, and something inside her shifted, like a door that had been locked for years finally swinging open. She set down her slate and reached up with both hands to cup his face. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But Daniel responded with a gentleness that made tears spring to Grace's eyes. His arms came around her, pulling her closer but not so tight that she felt trapped. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Grace grabbed her slate with shaking hands. I love you too. I think I have been afraid to admit it, even to myself. But I love you, Daniel Patterson. You have given me more than a home. You have given me back myself. Daniel read the words and his face transformed with joy. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Grace felt herself responding in ways she had not known she was capable of. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark with desire but also with restraint. Are you sure? He asked hoarsely. I meant what I said. I can wait as long as you need. Grace stood, still wrapped in the blanket, and held out her hand. Daniel took it, and she led him toward his bedroom, the larger of the two rooms, the one she had never entered before. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at him, making sure he understood that this was her choice, that she was ready. Daniel followed her inside and closed the door behind them. The morning sun was well up when Grace finally woke, nestled in Daniel's arms in his large bed. She felt sore and strange and completely content. Daniel was already awake, watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her want to cry. Good morning, wife, he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Grace smiled and reached for her slate, which Daniel had thoughtfully placed on the nightstand at some point during the night. Good morning, husband. They had to ride into Fort Bowie later that day to give their statements to the sheriff, as the deputy had requested. The whole town seemed to know about the raid by the time they arrived, and Grace found herself the object of admiring stares. Martha at the general store clasped her hands and declared her a heroine. Shot a rustler and saved her husband's life, Martha announced to anyone who would listen. And her a fine lady from Philadelphia. That is frontier spirit for you. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Coleman, took their statements with professional efficiency. He assured them that the wounded rustler was singing like a bird, giving up the names and locations of his partners. They will all be rounded up within the week, Sheriff Coleman said. We have had trouble with this gang for months. You did us a favor, Mrs. Patterson. That was fine shooting. As they left the sheriff's office, Grace saw Maria Rodriguez hurrying toward them. The older woman embraced Grace tightly, chattering in Spanish and English about how worried she had been. You must come for dinner soon, you and Daniel both, Maria insisted. My husband, he wants to thank you both. If they had not been stopped, they would have come for us again, I am sure. The invitation was accepted, and they parted with promises to visit within the week. As Daniel and Grace rode home, he reached over and took her hand. "You were amazing today," he said. "Facing all those people, holding your head high despite everything. You are stronger than you know, Grace." Grace squeezed his hand, thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had arrived in Arizona as a frightened, voiceless woman with no hope for the future. Now she had a home, a husband she loved, and the beginnings of real courage. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Grace had ever known. The threat of the rustlers was gone, and the ranch settled into a peaceful rhythm. Daniel hired help for the fall roundup, 3 cowboys who camped in the barn and worked from sunup to sundown. Grace cooked for them all, enormous meals of beef and beans and biscuits, and found satisfaction in feeding hungry men who appreciated her efforts. The garden was harvested, and the bounty stored away for winter. Grace and Maria spent several days together, making preserves and pickling vegetables, laughing over shared stories despite the language barrier. Maria taught Grace Spanish words, and Grace taught Maria to read simple English phrases, writing them on her slate and watching as Maria sounded them out carefully. As autumn deepened into winter, the first snow came to the mountains, though the valley remained relatively warm. Daniel and Grace fell into an easy domesticity, working side by side during the day and coming together each night with a passion that never seemed to diminish. Daniel had moved all of Grace's belongings into his room, and the smaller bedroom now stood empty, waiting for a purpose they had not yet discussed. It was in December, as they were preparing for Christmas, that Grace first suspected she might be pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses and found herself feeling queasy in the mornings. She said nothing at first, wanting to be sure before she raised Daniel's hopes. But when the symptoms continued into January, she knew she had to tell him. She chose an evening when they were sitting together by the fire, Daniel reading while Grace mended one of his shirts. She set down her sewing and pulled out her slate, writing carefully. "I think I am going to have a baby." Daniel's book fell from his hands. He stared at the slate, then at Grace, his eyes wide with wonder. "Are you certain?" Grace nodded, and then she was in his arms, being held so tightly she could barely breathe. She felt his shoulders shaking and realized he was crying, and her own tears followed quickly. "A baby," Daniel said, his voice muffled against her hair. "Our baby. Grace, you have made me the happiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Maria was delighted by the news and visited more frequently, bringing baby clothes she had saved from when her own children were small and offering advice on everything from morning sickness to the best position for labor. Martha at the general store gave Grace a bolt of soft flannel for making baby gowns, refusing to accept payment. "Consider it a gift from the town," Martha said. "We take care of our own out here." Daniel was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting that Grace rest more and work less. She humored him when she could, but she was not an invalid and refused to be treated as one. She continued to tend the garden, now coming back to life with the spring rains, and to care for the chickens and the house. But she allowed Daniel to take over the heavier chores, and she napped in the afternoons when the baby's weight made her tired. One warm evening in May, when Grace was about 7 months along, she and Daniel were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Grace had been feeling the baby move all day, strong kicks and rolls that made her gasp. She took Daniel's hand and placed it on her swollen belly, and his face lit up when he felt the movement beneath his palm. "He is strong," Daniel said. Grace reached for her slate. "You think it is a girl?" Daniel asked, smiling. "I do not know. But I am tired of everyone assuming it will be a boy." Daniel laughed. "Fair enough. Boy or girl, I will love this child more than life itself, just as I love you." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling at peace in a way she never had before. The sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air was soft with the promise of summer. She thought about how far she had come, from the silent, frightened woman who had stepped off the stage nearly a year ago to the confident wife and soon-to-be mother she was now. As if sensing her thoughts, Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Do you ever regret coming here?" he asked softly. Grace sat up and looked at him, then reached for her slate. She wrote slowly, wanting to get the words exactly right. "I regret nothing. Coming here was the best decision I ever made. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me patience when I needed it most. You gave me love I did not think I deserved. I am grateful every day that I found you." Daniel's eyes were suspiciously bright as he read her words. "I am the one who should be grateful," he said. "You brought light into my life, Grace. Before you came, this was just a place I lived. Now it is a home because you are in it." The baby arrived on a hot July night, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Grace had been feeling restless all day, unable to settle to any task. Maria, who had stopped by to visit, took one look at her and announced that the baby would come soon. "I know these things," Maria said confidently. "I have had 7 babies of my own. Send Daniel for the midwife now, before it is too late." Daniel rode for town immediately, returning with Mrs. Kimball, a competent woman who had delivered most of the babies in Fort Bowie for the past 20 years. She examined Grace, nodded, and began giving instructions to boil water and gather clean linens. The labor was long and difficult. Grace bore it in silence, as she bore everything, but Daniel could see the pain in her face as the contractions grew stronger and closer together. He held her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth and murmuring encouragement that he hoped she could hear through the haze of pain. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, the baby came. Mrs. Kimball caught the infant with practiced hands and announced, "It is a boy, a healthy boy." The baby's first cry was strong and indignant, and Grace felt tears streaming down her face as Mrs. Kimball placed the tiny, squirming bundle on her chest. She looked down at her son, at his red face and dark hair and the way his tiny fists waved in the air, and felt a love so overwhelming it stole her breath. Daniel was crying too, bending over both of them with an expression of absolute awe. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Grace, he is perfect." They named him David, after Grace's father. Little David Patterson was indeed perfect, with his father's dark hair and what promised to be his mother's delicate features. He was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in stretches long enough that Grace did not feel too exhausted. The house was filled with visitors in the days after David's birth. Maria came daily, helping with the cooking and cleaning and offering endless advice. Martha brought gifts from the townspeople, practical things like more flannel and a wooden cradle that one of the ranchers had made. Even Sheriff Coleman stopped by, presenting them with a silver spoon that had been his own son's. "For your boy," the sheriff said gruffly. "May he grow up strong and honest like his father." Grace's life settled into a new rhythm, organized around David's needs. She nursed him and changed him and rocked him when he cried, marveling at how someone so small could have taken over her life so completely. Daniel was a devoted father, coming in from the ranch several times a day to check on his son and insisting on taking the night feedings so Grace could rest. "I can give him sugar water from a bottle," Daniel said when Grace protested. "You need your sleep." As summer turned to fall and David grew from a newborn to a chubby, smiling baby, Grace found herself thinking more and more about her voice. She had been content without speech for so long, finding ways to communicate that worked for her. But she wanted to talk to her son. She wanted to sing him lullabies and tell him stories and say his name out loud. One evening, when David was about 4 months old, Grace was rocking him to sleep. She hummed the lullaby her mother had taught her, the same one she had hummed to calm the frightened horse so many months ago. David's eyes were drifting closed, and Grace felt such a surge of love that the words simply came. "Hush, little baby, do not say a word," she sang, her voice rusty and soft but unmistakably real. "Mama is going to buy you a mockingbird." She stopped, shocked by the sound of her own voice. David's eyes opened and he stared at her with baby fascination. From the doorway, Grace heard a sound and looked up to see Daniel standing there, his face transfixed. "Grace," he breathed. "You are speaking." Grace opened her mouth and tried again. "I am speaking," she said, and the words came easier this time, as if her voice had just been waiting for the right moment to return. "Daniel, I am speaking." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled both her and the baby into his arms. "Say my name again," he demanded. "Daniel," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Daniel, Daniel, Daniel." They sat together on the floor, Daniel's arms around his wife and son, while Grace spoke every word she could think of. Her voice grew stronger with each sentence, as if making up for 3 years of silence. She said Daniel's name and David's name and told them both that she loved them. She described the sunset and the mountains and the way the desert smelled after rain. She spoke until her throat was sore, and then she spoke some more, drunk on the miracle of her returned voice. "What made it come back?" Daniel asked when Grace finally paused for breath. "Love," Grace said simply. "I wanted to talk to our son so badly that the fear just could not hold me anymore. I thought about how you waited for me, how patient you were, and I realized I did not need to be afraid." "Not here, not with you." "I would have waited forever," Daniel said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But I am so glad I do not have to." The rest of that autumn and winter passed in a blur of happiness. Grace spoke to everyone she met, still marveling at the return of her voice. She sang to David constantly, teaching him the songs her mother had taught her. She chattered with Maria in a mixture of English and Spanish, laughing at her own mistakes. She read aloud to Daniel in the evenings, her voice bringing new life to the words on the page. David grew from a baby to a toddler, walking at 10 months and talking soon after. He was a happy child, bright and curious, with his father's steadiness and his mother's gentleness. He loved the ranch, toddling after Daniel to see the horses and cattle, and helping Grace gather eggs from the chickens. When David was 2 years old, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time, she was able to tell Daniel immediately, speaking the words aloud with joy. "We are going to have another baby," she announced one morning over breakfast. Daniel's whoop of excitement startled David, who began laughing and clapping his hands, even though he did not understand what was happening. They celebrated with a special dinner, and that night, lying in bed with Daniel's hand on her still flat belly, Grace felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "Did you ever imagine your life would be like this?" she asked Daniel softly. "Never," he admitted. "When I sent for a mail order bride, I hoped for companionship, maybe eventually affection. I never dreamed I would find my soulmate. You are everything I did not know I needed, Grace." The second baby, a daughter they named Dorothy after Daniel's mother, arrived in late summer. She was smaller than David had been, but just as healthy, with her mother's light hair and her father's brown eyes. David was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feedings. Life on the ranch continued to thrive. Daniel had expanded his herd and built a reputation for raising quality cattle. He hired a full-time hand, a young man named Jesse who lived in the bunkhouse and proved to be a hard worker. The ranch was prosperous enough that Daniel was able to add a new room onto the house, giving David and Dorothy their own bedrooms. Grace had become well known in Fort Bowie, not just as the woman who had shot a rustler, but as someone people could turn to in times of trouble. She had helped Maria deliver a grandchild when the midwife could not get there in time. She had nursed several townspeople through a bout of influenza. She had become a pillar of the small community, despite her unusual past. One afternoon in the spring of 1883, nearly 5 years after Grace had first arrived in Arizona, she was working in her expanded garden when a stagecoach pulled up at the house. Grace stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and watched as a well-dressed woman climbed down. It took her a moment to recognize her former neighbor from Philadelphia, Mrs. Henderson. "Grace Remington," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, then corrected herself. "Or I suppose it is Patterson now. My dear, I had to see for myself that you were all right. When you disappeared so suddenly, there were all sorts of rumors." Grace invited Mrs. Henderson inside, serving her tea and cookies, while the older woman looked around the simple but comfortable house with obvious curiosity. David and Dorothy were napping, and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock Daniel had given Grace for Christmas. "You must tell me everything," Mrs. Henderson said. "How did you end up in Arizona of all places? And I heard you speaking when you greeted me." "Have you recovered your voice?" Grace told her story, leaving out the darkest parts about her stepmother, but explaining about the mail-order marriage and the life she had built with Daniel. Mrs. Henderson listened with wide eyes, occasionally interjecting with exclamations of surprise. "And you are happy here?" Mrs. Henderson asked finally. "In this wilderness so far from civilization?" "I am happier than I ever was in Philadelphia," Grace said firmly. "I have a husband who loves me, 2 beautiful children, and a home that is truly mine. What more could I want, Mrs.?" Henderson seemed to accept this, and they chatted for a while longer about mutual acquaintances and news from the city. But when she left, promising to write and keep in touch, Grace felt only relief. Her old life seemed like a dream now, disconnected from the reality of who she had become. That evening, after the children were in bed, Grace told Daniel about the visit. He listened carefully, then pulled her into his arms. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The city, the life you had before?" "No," Grace said without hesitation. "That life had no room for the real me. Here, I can be exactly who I am, and I am loved for it. That is worth more than all the cities in the world." The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also deep joy. David grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as ranching. Dorothy was her brother's opposite, wild and fearless, always coming home with scraped knees and torn dresses from climbing trees or chasing cattle. Grace and Daniel had one more child, a son they named Samuel, who arrived when Dorothy was 4. The ranch continued to prosper. Daniel bought more land, expanding his holdings until he was one of the larger ranchers in the area. They built a bigger house, with a proper parlor and a dining room and enough bedrooms for their growing family. But they kept the original adobe structure, using it as a guest house and remembering it as the place where their love had grown. Grace's voice never failed her again. She sang in the church choir that Fort Bowie established in 1885. She read to her children every night, bringing stories to life with different voices and expressions. She talked to Daniel constantly, making up for those early months of silence with a river of words that never seemed to run dry. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel gave Grace a journal bound in leather. "For your words," he said, "so you can write down all the stories you tell the children, and they can read them to their own children someday." Grace was touched by the gift and began writing that very night, recording not just stories but memories. She wrote about arriving in Fort Bowie with a slate in her hands and fear in her heart. She wrote about the first time Daniel kissed her and the night David was born. She wrote about finding her voice again and the life she had built from nothing. The children grew older and the ranch grew larger, and through it all, Grace and Daniel's love continued to deepen. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and difficult births, the everyday challenges of life on the frontier. But they had weathered them together, and that made all the difference. One evening, when Grace was 43 and Daniel 45, they sat on the porch of their house and watched their grandchildren play in the yard. David had married a schoolteacher from Tucson and had 2 children of his own. Dorothy had shocked everyone by choosing to attend college in California, becoming a teacher herself before returning to Arizona and marrying a lawyer. Samuel was still young, only 16, but already showing signs of being the best rancher of them all. "We did well," Daniel said, reaching for Grace's hand. "Look at what we built." Grace squeezed his hand, looking out at the prosperous ranch, the happy grandchildren, the life they had created together. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "You said you would wait until I was ready. You gave me time to heal, time to learn to trust again. You gave me everything." "You gave me more," Daniel said. "You gave me yourself when you had every reason to hold back. You gave me children and a home and a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive." "I am the luckiest man in the world, Grace Patterson." Grace turned to kiss him, still finding joy in this simple gesture after so many years. Around them, the desert was turning gold in the setting sun and the mountains stood eternal against the sky. This was home, Grace thought. Not just this place, but this man, this life they had built together from a foundation of patience and trust and love. When she had stepped off that stagecoach 25 years ago, silent and afraid, she could never have imagined this future. But Daniel had seen something in her that she had not yet seen in herself. He had looked at a voiceless woman with a broken spirit and whispered, "I will wait until you are ready." And in waiting, in giving her the space to heal and grow, he had given her back herself. That was the greatest gift of all, Grace thought, as she sat on the porch with her husband's hand in hers and watched the sun set over the land they both loved. Daniel had given her time, and time had given her everything else. The evening deepened into night, and the grandchildren were called inside for supper. Grace and Daniel remained on the porch a while longer, content in each other's company as they had been since that first awkward meal so many years ago. The stars came out, brilliant in the clear desert sky, and Grace thought about all the nights she had looked at those same stars, watching them change from symbols of loneliness to markers of home. She had arrived as a mail-order bride in silence, too broken to speak, too afraid to hope. But the cowboy had whispered that he would wait until she was ready, and in that whisper she had found the courage to begin again. She had found her voice, her strength, and most importantly, her heart. And now, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, Grace knew that every moment of fear, every silent day, every painful memory had been worth it to arrive at this perfect present. She had come to Arizona expecting duty and found love instead, and that love had healed every wound and filled every empty space in her soul. Daniel turned to her in the darkness, his face barely visible but his love palpable in the way he held her hand. "Ready to go inside, my love?" "Always," Grace said, and her voice was strong and sure, full of all the words she had once thought lost forever. "As long as I am with you, I am always ready." They walked inside together, leaving the porch light burning for Samuel when he came in from checking on the horses. Behind them, the desert night sang its ancient song, and the house that had started as a simple adobe structure stood solid and welcoming, filled with the laughter and love of a family that had been born from patience and trust. Grace's journey from silence to speech, from fear to love, from brokenness to wholeness was complete. She had found everything she needed in this wild, beautiful land, and in the arms of the man who had promised to wait. And in the end, the waiting had been worth every moment, because it had led them both to exactly where they were meant to be, home together, forever.